So good afternoon. Welcome to the Museum of the Albemarle. Again, we are trying our hybrid programming once more through education. So today we have some guests in the auditorium with us, which we're excited to finally welcome visitors back into the museum. And we also have quite a few guests through Zoom today. We are going to get ready to turn our April history lunch over to Mr. Tony Lillis. He wrote the book, Surfing the Virginia Beach and the Outer Banks. I've been working with Mr. Lillis this morning, so I'm excited to hear the talk right now because I've been able to see some of the photographs, and I actually got a preview of some of his notes, and I recognized quite a few names in his notes today. So we're excited. The book, if you would like to purchase the book, it is available in the museum shop. And we'll go ahead and get started. Mr. Lillis, if you'd like to come on up. So please bear with us if we have any technical difficulties. So I'd like to introduce Mr. Lillis. He will be joining us, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start the screen share for Mr. Lillis so we can go ahead and get started today. If you have any questions for us, if you will please type your questions in the Q&A, and we will get to them at the end of the talk today. So Mr. Lillis, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I really very much appreciate you all coming out to hear this talk and for being here. I started this book out a long time ago, and it started out just to be on Virginia beach surfing. Someone had said, we need a book on the history of Virginia beach surfing. And I've been surfing for a long time myself, but I knew that there was an incredible history there. But what I found out right away is I couldn't contain the history of Virginia beach surfing in Virginia Beach, because there was just so much cross-pollination. There were, of course, the Californians who were coming over to try to sell surfboards at that time, Hobie Alter and Dewey Weber. You had In the Summer coming out in '64, which Bruce Brown personally narrated that film in front of a packed audience before it was even released a couple years later by Hollywood. The Floridians were coming up and taking home a bunch of the trophies when they were coming up to Virginia Beach for contests or to the ESA championships in Buxton. So when I started getting into the history of Virginia Beach surfing, I realized I've got to learn a lot more than just about Virginia Beach because there was so much. And then, of course, it didn't take Virginia Beach surfers long to learn how excellent the surfing is out on the Outer Banks. And so there was a lot of cross-pollination there as well. And so all of it came together as really a history of surfing Virginia Beach and the Outer Banks, but it's also the book, A History of Surfing on the East Coast, because there's just so much. I guess I would start by pointing out that in the find the photo. Maybe push to the first. There we go. So the history of surfing really started back in the 1800s in Hawaii, of course, and long before that in Hawaii, but people started reading about Hawaiian surfing in the newspapers. So New Bern and Charlotte and Raleigh all carried newspaper articles about the sport of Hawaiian surfing dating to the late 1800s. It wasn't until 1909 that Wrightsville Beach had the very first surfing contest. And they advertised it as one of the most interesting and entertaining events for spectators, the surfboard sports, which probably included paddling and riding the waves. And however the contest went back then, in 1912, 3 years later, the Virginian pilot in Norfolk wrote an article about how wave shooting contests were going to be on the bill that summer using dories and canoes. And so just as in Hawaii, the canoes, they would ride the waves of the canoes. That was happening on the East Coast in Virginia Beach. There was a nice story about the popularity of surfing. It was already taking hold in the beach colony, as it was called. It was just a small little area. And then a couple years after that, 1914, there was a story about a gentleman he took around the world trip, and his name was Walter Irvine. He was a cotton merchant, wealthy. He ended up in Hawaii, and he somehow got himself aboard there and shipped it home to his nephew, James Jordan. And so in 1912, 1913, that's kind of when Virginia Beach is known to have gotten its first actual surfboard. The article went on to say that the lumber yards were being contacted about getting materials to build new surfboards, and that surfing looked like it was really going to take hold in Virginia Beach. And so that was 1914. Of course, in 1912, when the history books say surfing was introduced on the East Coast, was by Duke Kahanamoku. The Duke was an Olympic swimmer. He was, of course, a lifeguard. He was a surfer, and he was on his way to the Olympics in Amsterdam. And he stopped in Philadelphia, where he trained at the University of Pennsylvania in this pool there. And while he was in Philly, he made a couple trips over to Ocean City, New Jersey, Atlantic City, New Jersey. And then on his way back, he stopped in New York. He actually lost to Johnny Weissmuller, Tarzan, at that particular Olympics in 1912, but he would continue to go to the Olympics 1916, 1920. Let's see if I can. So Duke met this guy named Tom Blake, and Tom Blake was a guy, he was just out of high school. This would have been around 1920. He was in Detroit. He came to see the Duke give a speech. Duke was giving a cross-country tour, goodwill tour coming back from the Olympics. And Tom Blake was so excited and impressed with the Duke that he wanted to follow in his footsteps. So he headed to California, where he hooked back up with Duke, and he became himself a champion swimmer. He became a lifeguard. He started getting into the whole surfing thing right there, but he didn't know how to surf yet. Duke, of course, had the entree in Hawaii. And so Tom Blake made a trip over to Hawaii, and he started to learn to surf there from some of Duke's friends. So he was with the royalty. And he ended up going to the Bishop's Museum, which is a museum there that had all the old surfboards. And he got really interested in the design of surfing and the design of surfboards, and spent a lot of time with that. He would end up revolutionizing surfing by coming up with a paddleboard design, which took a lot of the weight out of the board. These old Hawaiian boards were big, thick, tall, solid wood boards that were very heavy. And Blake wanted to figure out a way to make them much lighter. And he thought, well, if I make a frame, make it more like a boat, take some of that middle out, it'll paddle faster, it'll catch the waves easier. So that was what Blake's mission was. He was a full-on surfer and a lifeguard. He would travel a lot. He came to Florida, and he would live out of his car. He literally was kind of like the beach bum. I think he lived out of his car a lot during his life when he was on the road. And down there, he met a couple guys from Virginia Beach, and those were John Smith and Dusty Hennett. And Smith, of course, some of you know his nephew, Pete Smith, who's a well-known Virginia Beach surfer back in the 60s. But John Smith, his family owned the Albemarle Hall Hotel. And he invited Dusty to come back with him. Dusty was a lifeguard, Red Cross certified. He had lifeguarded at lakes, but never at the ocean. But back then, the hotels hired the lifeguards, and the lifeguards made their money by renting out concessions. So they would rent out chairs and floats, umbrellas, all those sorts of things. And so when Dusty and John finished up the summer season in Virginia Beach, they would head south for the winter and set up concessions down in Florida. And they took their big surfboard, and they would take it down there with them and demonstrate surfing along the way. And that's how they ended up meeting Blake. Well, somehow John Smith got a hold of the plans for Tom Blake's new paddleboard. And he got 6 sets of these boards cut out. He's got them back up in Virginia Beach, and he had a carpenter scale them. They actually did blueprints with them. They tried to figure out how to make this board as airtight and watertight as possible. And so they made 6 sets of the boards, and then the boards started showing up in Virginia Beach. And let me see if I can, got to get used to a little bit here. They would make these boards, and other people started making them. There's a guy named Baby Breathwaite. Breathwaite is an old Virginia Beach name. I know Breathwaite's lived down this way too. But he was a very good athlete, and he made some boards as well. And so you started seeing these big old paddle boards show up in Virginia Beach, and they're all the lifeguards are the ones who were using them at the time. And they, of course, had these, were so heavy. This was the shoulder carry. You had to figure out how to carry these things to the beach, because there was only one, you couldn't put them under your arm, so you had to put them up over your shoulder. And you can see they could catch these big swells coming in on these real big paddle boards. So in North Carolina at the time, in the 30s, you had Tom Fearing and David Stick, and they had a board. They were fishing with it, though, it seemed like. I think you saw that image up earlier, showed them with all the fish. So there were surfboards down here, but don't have any documentation of anyone riding them at the time. But nonetheless, it was still catching on. And you move into the 50s, and the juniper boards were really popular. You know, you'd ride anything you could if you were able to get a mat or some kind of a board. The juniper boards were about 3 feet long. David Stick's wife, Phyllis, she had them in the Kitty Hawk craft shop. And so you could purchase those, and you could rent the beach mats, the blow up mats and things like that. And then as the 50s, of course, the war, World War II, everyone went off to war, and surfing kind of died a little bit, but there was a guy named Bob Holland. Bob Holland was born in, I think, the late 20s, and he was riding surfboards on John Smith's shoulder, and Baby Breathwaite holding him up over his head when he was like 10 years old. But Bob Holland, he would come to be an important name in surfing history, in not just Virginia Beach and the Outer Banks, but really the whole East Coast and surfing world. He was a 6-time US surfing champion. So by the time the 50s got here, Holland found there was a Californian stationed at Fort Story, and he was in Virginia Beach. He knew Hap Jacobs was a Hermosa Beach guy in California, and he got some of these new polyurethane light surfboards flown in. There were half dozen of them. So the era of the big paddleboard now had passed, and now the new materials were coming in. And the community was very small. So you had a little bit of everything in terms of surfing. But then down in Nags Head was a guy, Bruce Shepard, and he was one of the few people who lived year-round, his family in Nags Head, and he recalled Hurricane Helene in 1958. And some Californians came through. They flew in, and they had about 6 boards with them, and they had heard they were chasing this hurricane swell. They knew it was coming, and they flew in, and the East Coast guys were really hungry to get out and see the world, and to go to where the waves were really good. And so you had some of the people, like I've mentioned, David Shepard, who grew up across the street from the Nags Head Pier. You know, he would travel and go out to Indonesia. He'd stay for 6 months. From there, he'd go down to Australia. David Crockett Farrow, Crockett was his nickname, but he was another one. He was from Manteo, and these guys, they they go to Hawaii every year, first of all, and they kind of blend in with the international community there. But then they just keep traveling, and like I said, they go to Indonesia, they go to Japan, they go to Australia. They were exploring, and so a lot of the surfers from this area were moving out into the surfing world and being noticed. And in fact, it was in 1974, Jeff Crawford, he was from Florida. The Floridian guys are obviously pretty good surfers in general, but he was the first one to win the Pipeline Masters from the East Coast. And so in 74, you had Ricky Rasmussen winning the US championships. You had Jeff Crawford from Florida winning the Pipeline Masters in Hawaii. All of a sudden, people are looking at the East Coast with more respect. And the thing about East Coast surfers is you'd say, well, there's hardly any waves, or the waves aren't as consistent as California. You don't see but the East Coasters try hard. They work really hard, and they take what they have and they maximize it. And so the East Coast guys made a name in the world. They got out there, and then of course you had all the people coming to ECSC and the ESAs. So, and then the Virginia Beach guys, like Wes Lane, he was good enough to where he got on the International Surfing Tour, and he was from Virginia Beach, but he spent most of his time down on the Outer Banks. He grew up in the ESA, competing in that. And at that time, the ESA, it was the Virginia Beach Outer Banks district. So they were one district. So they competed together. And so again, you had all the Virginia Beach guys adopting the Outer Banks as their home. So as the 80s came in, more manufacturing, New Sun surfboards. Mickey McCarthy started New Sun. He had shaped boards for wave riding vehicles, and but he wanted to get his own board shop going, and so he took a place right across from the Nags Head Pier where he made the boards there. Of course, with the smells of making surfboards and all the different materials, they chased them out of there because the restaurants were nearby, and you couldn't have a surfboard manufacturing area in a restaurant district. But he brought along guys like Murray Ross and Roscoe Hunt and Steve Head. And so there was a real energy of manufacturing in Nags Head. And then you had WRV moved its manufacturing operation to the Outer Banks. It was in Virginia Beach up until about 86. So the manufacturing started really centering on the Outer Banks because all the shapers wanted to be near the better waves. And so they just as soon be down here building boards as in Virginia Beach. And so that's how the manufacturing really sort of consolidated. But so the 80s and the Easterns would lead to really incredible future of East Coast surfing, because at that time you had this guy named Kelly Slater. He was a young kid, and he would end up being the greatest all-time surfer in the history of competitive surfing. He's from Cocoa Beach, he's from Florida, but he was coming up to the Easterns in Buxton. He won 5 ESA championships. And then you had other CJ Hobgood. He was another future world champion from Florida, came up to the Eastern Surfing Championships, came up to the East Coast Surfing Championships in Virginia Beach. He was another world champion surfer. Kathy Anderson on the women's side, Frida Zama, 2 women. Between them, they had 10 world championships on the women's side. So the East Coast has 20 world championships to their credit. They're all Floridians, and they came up through the ESA, and then they came up to the Hatteras Lighthouse and had their championships there. So I point that out just to say that, this is not a backwater in surfing. When you talk about the East Coast, or certainly Cape Hatteras or Virginia Beach, it's been a training ground because the waves get powerful there. And so as the 90s came on, again on the Outer Banks, you had a new crop, a young crop, Noah Snyder, Jesse Hines, Matt Beecham, Billy Hume. They all make their name on the world as professional world traveling surfers. Wasn't always on a competitive level. Sometimes it was a photographer would take them down to Fiji and do a big photo shoot, and they'd be on the cover of Surfer Magazine, or they'd be on the cover of Surfing Magazine. Jesse Hines, I know, was on the cover of all the major surfing magazines, and again, the prominence of these East Coasters, making East Coasters proud with getting worldwide coverage. And so in 2017, the ESA celebrated its 50th anniversary. It's the largest, and it has always been the largest surfing organization in the world. The West Coast people were a little too laid back. They had an organization, the Hawaiian Surfing Association. Of course, they didn't have the numbers that the East had, but there were 7,000 members of the Eastern Surfing Association, and it held a competitive circuit like has never been held before in any of the other surfing associations. Then the ECSC this year will celebrate its 58th. It's the oldest surfing contest in the world. I think because of COVID, the previously oldest did not have their contest this past year, but the ECSC went on under some restrictions. And so now you have the oldest surf contest in the world in Virginia Beach. You have some of the greatest surfers having come through Cape Hatteras and Virginia Beach. And what it really points to, and just in conclusion here, is that Virginia Beach and the Outer Banks, both together and separately, a lot of cross-pollination, but it's an epic center of East Coast surfing where we live today. So thank you so much. Sure. So I'll just take you through some of these pictures which you weren't able to see. These are some of the old ones from Virginia Beach. When Bruce Shepard's there watching the guys from California out surfing double out beyond the pier, you can see from this image how scary that might be to be way out past the pier surfing. They look small there, but when you get out under them, they're like 12-foot, 15-foot walls. Of course, this is the Ash Wednesday storm, which, you can see if you look at, you can see the waves, see how big the waves are, even from the air way off, you can see how big those waves look. Of course, devastated the island. These are the early East Coast Surfing Championships. That's Hobie Ultra's back to us, getting ready to send the surfers out into the waves. This is the group of 27 surfers who went up to the first Gilgo Beach East Coast Surfing Championships. And they brought the contest back down the next year in '63. Bob Holland, right there, and John Hannon, he was the guy that organized the contest up in New York. And he agreed with Holland to bring it down to Virginia Beach. You see some of this is the first contest. You see the style surfing, the girl's bikini there, and the loose fitting clothes and the style, which was attractive. That's Greg Knoll and Pete Smith. Greg Knoll was the first one to surf the Bonsai Pipeline. No one had the nerve to do it until he did it. There he is next to Pete Smith, who opened up Smith and Holland with Bob Holland. They shipped in some palm trees to make it look like Hawaii. But that's Virginia Beach right there. This is Jimbo Brothers. He lived out here on the Outer Banks for a long time after growing up in Virginia Beach, but he was a real character. There he is, a kid, and you just see the style and the energy he has. And again, the floral beach style that became popular back then. It was wild fashion that the Virginia pilot was talking about. They'd never seen such crazy fashion. That's Mimi Monroe. She was the women's champion. Look at her hanging 10 on the edge of that board. She was from Florida. She retired at age 15 as a two-time Eastern champion, got back into surfing later on. Those are the judges. Now, you might wonder, well, who are those? Those are all the Californians there. Joyce Hoffman and Mickey Munoz and all the big names coming to Virginia Beach. They were considered, it's like seeing movie stars, I guess, at that time. You had those guys actually on the beach judging the contest. That's Bob Holland. You can see what command he has of the board and the wave there coming down, hanging 10. That's what Virginia Beach looked like back before it looked like today from the pier, the steel pier, which is no longer there. Here you have, this is on the Outer Banks here. This is a Kitty Hawk, and Gov Ward is presenting a presentation of this license plate, excuse me, to a guy who's trying to paddle down from Long Island, New York, all the way down to Charleston or somewhere. And so he came on the beach and all the local surfers gathered around and presented him this honorary. He actually ended up not making it because someone who was going by the Nags Head Pier and someone hit him with a weight or something. He had to come out of the water. So that's a typical surfing story. But in that picture, like I said, there's Johnny Midget and Jim Bunch and Gov Ward. Of course, everyone remembers how the lighthouse fought a valiant battle before they had to finally move it. That's a picture from around the early 70s of the bags trying to buttress it. I always like this picture because it just sort of captures that tumbling down the face of the wave. He's holding on to everything and he's completely engaged. You can see he's totally focused. It's, and I just think it sort of captures well this avalanche as you're on the surfboard riding down. Here's a contest and there's judges. This would be on the Outer Banks and there's a guy doing his best to impress the judges. As I mentioned, the manufacturing was a big thing. Started in Virginia Beach, but then it really spread to the Outer Banks. That's a shot of the lighthouse even earlier than the one I just showed. That's from '62, and before they had sandbagged it. And you can see it was on its last legs even then. Aerial shot from the lighthouse, looking south. Looks a lot different now, even though there's still plenty of. Another aerial shot. I guess that's looking in Kitty Hawk. Of course, I mentioned how in the 70s things kind of got more countercultural, and the VW microbus was kind of the standard hippie bus, but the surfers adopted it as their own, and they throw as many boards on it, and they come down here or go wherever and stay for as long as they could. And then again, the surf shops sort of had just kind of a little funky, outpost feel, very informal. That shop's still there. And then these are some more modern shots of some of the shops, but they always had a lot of character. I mentioned the fights with the town elders, the hotel owners, the pier owners. So they had to put all these signs up and enforce strict surfing rules. You could be fined. You could have your surfboard confiscated from you. You didn't want to get arrested for surfing if you could help it. Didn't stop people though. I mentioned the United States Surfing Championships. That's the 1982 U.S. Surfing Championships. And then just wanted to close with a couple nice Hatteras style, Hatteras size hurricane swells. That's Mickey McCarthy. Mickey started New Sun surfboards. And like I said, he brought along a lot of the new generation of shapers on the Outer Banks. He passed away a couple years ago. And then this shot's on the cover of the book, and it just shows another, monster surf wave during a hurricane taken from the pier. So you can kind of get right in there and feel that. So I think that's it. Thank you so much. Okay.
So through Facebook, you might have to repeat the question for me. But the comment was made, Ted Kearns is a great shaper who started with New Sun surfboards. He's now in Hawaii. They also wanted to know, with the technical issue that we had, did you talk about Jimbo Brothers, Virginia Beach surfer, whatever happened to him?
Yes, Jimbo, he of course grew up in Virginia Beach, and you saw him hanging 10 with his hands up over his head, and he was a real stylist, and he was a real energetic from a young age. Everyone was impressed with his surfing. Yes, Carnes, he was one of the ones that came along with Mickey McCarthy and Rasco Hunt and Murray Ross, and so yes, there was a whole group that New Sun Surfboard brought along, who almost all of them went out and started shaping their own boards under their own names. I think his was TK. But all the guys that came up through wave riding vehicles they would A lot of them branched out and did their own boards, and then same with New Sun. So wave riding vehicles and New Sun, real important in terms of surfboard manufacturing.
I'll let you get the question from the audience. Where is Jimbo now? That's what they asked.
I'm sorry?
Where is Jimbo, brother?
Jimbo passed away he passed away a couple years ago. He lived down here for a long time. When I say down here, I mean like out in Kitty Hawk. I think actually he was in a nursing home of some sort, and only in the last year or two did he pass away.
Okay.
Yes.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Before I go back to, I'm gonna have to go through that.
Yeah, I got one.
Okay.
You were talking about West Lane,
Yes.
and I remember seeing him out there at the lighthouse. Wasn't he world champion at one time?
He wasn't a world champion, but he went out on the world tour.
I thought he got world champion.
So what happened was he was running through the normal contest, but he went up to a contest in New Jersey, and Rabbit Bartholomew is this famous Hawaiian world champion. He did really well against him, and then the opportunity presented itself. He had one semester to go in college, but he dropped out. He went to Australia, and he went on the world tour for 5 years, and he ended up in the top 16 twice. So he was a top world surfer in the top 16.
So he didn't make the fight.
He didn't win the championship, no, but he was one of the first ones who made a name for himself on the international tour.
He was a tall guy.
Very tall, 6'4", big tall guy.
Out there. I was like, how does he surf?
He's just a real big guy. He'd be the farthest guy out, and he'd paddle and he'd ride that thing all the way in, and he's still out there surfing today.
We have one more question. Do you have any information on Captain Bob Holland, father of Bob Lee Holland, the 6-time U.S. surfing champion? When he was surfing too, Captain Bob, Bob Lee, and Bobby were all Virginia Harbor pilots.
Yes, Captain Holland. I mentioned Bob Holland a lot in my talk because he's very important to both Virginia Beach and the Outer Banks. His father was Captain Holland, and his father had a couple of the old paddle boards, and that's how Bob Holland learned. He would drag these big old 12-foot paddle boards to the beach, 24th Street in Virginia Beach. So Captain Holland, and I believe he was out there paddling and surfing some, and Bob Holland had 3 kids, Bobby, John, and Honey Holland. All 3 of his kids were champion surfers as well. I know Honey Holland, she won several Eastern surfing championships. John Holland, Bobby Holland, the whole family is a tremendous surfing family, all champion surfers.
One more on that one.
Yes.
Was one of them a doctor?
John Holland. John Holland
How
became.
old would he be about?
He would probably be late 60s.
Yeah, I remember him out there too.
Yeah, he was really good.
He was an older guy when I was surfing, like Kitty Hawk.
Right.
And he used to always take off behind the peak.
Yes.
They could get off his weight.
I think, John Holland was definitely one of the better surfers. And
He was
then
good.
very good. And Bobby too, but then Honey, they lived down here on the Outer Banks in the summers. And so she competed in all the contests out here on the Outer Banks, and she won several championships. So yeah, it's really the whole family.
He usually had his son with him, but I swear the old man was better.
Yeah, Bob Holland Sr.
Yeah, the guy about 60.
Yeah, Bob was amazing. Into his 70s, he was surfing big, overhead surf.
He's still alive.
No, he passed away as well I think he died about 5 years ago. Yes. But his son, I know Bobby lives in the Outer Banks right now. So, any other questions or comments?
ECSC Surf Legend Class of 2017 Jimbo Brothers Surfing Community, one of the top proponents of the East Coast shortboard revolution. Jimbo was the charismatic kingpin of the steel pier during his heyday, mid 1960s to 70s. So, and I guess they quoted that from.
Oh, yep. That's exactly right.
Any other questions that we can entertain today? Thank you all for coming out. Sorry about the technical difficulties, but we made it through it. We should have ended up having it recorded. We would also like to invite you to our museum shop if you're interested in Mr. Lillis' book. It is available in the museum shop, and he will be available to sign the book after the program. Again, thank you for everyone coming out today.
Thanks so much.